In March 2026, a Los Angeles jury found Meta and Google liable for the psychological harm caused to a young woman who had grown up using their platforms, YouTube from age 6 and Instagram from age 9. The damages awarded were $6 million. That number will mean nothing to either company. What it does mean, and this is the part worth paying attention to, is that for the first time, a jury looked at the internal architecture of these products, heard the evidence, and decided that the design itself was the problem. This case is one of thousands waiting in line. A bellwether trial, they call it. A test case chosen specifically to see how a jury reacts before the larger flood of litigation begins. The flood is coming. And so the question worth asking, the one this episode is about, isn't whether these companies did something wrong. It's how they built what they built. What decisions made quietly inside the product teams led to a courtroom in Los Angeles 2 decades later, and what the actual architecture looks like, and why it's so hard to walk away from. Here is something worth remembering. The social media feed, as we experience it today, is a relatively recent invention. And it was a choice, not a technical inevitability. When Facebook launched its newsfeed in 2006, it was reverse chronological. You saw what was posted most recently from the people you followed. It was simple, transparent, and a little boring. It also had a natural rhythm. You'd scroll, catch up, and be done. The pivot happened gradually. In 2009 to 2011, platforms began experimenting with ranking. Instead of showing you what was newest, they'd show you what they thought was most relevant. And relevance, it turned out, was a word that could mean almost anything. What it came to mean operationally, technically, was what will keep this person engaged longest. That single redefinition changed everything that followed. Let's start with the mechanism most people interact with every single day without thinking about it: the like. When Facebook introduced the like button in 2009, it looked like a feature for users, a quick, frictionless way to express approval. But from an engineering perspective, it was something else entirely. It was a data point. Every like told the algorithm something about the content, about the person liking it, and about what to show next. The more you liked, the more the algorithm learned. The more it learned, the better it got at predicting what you'd engage with. And the better it got at prediction, the harder it became to look away. Because the feed started to feel like it understood you, like it was made for you specifically. And it was. That's the point. This is sometimes called a feedback loop. But that phrase makes it sound passive, like something that just happens. It is not passive. It was engineered. The loop was the product. Instagram's algorithm has evolved significantly since Facebook acquired it in 2012, but the core logic has remained consistent. Surface content that drives interaction. Comments, shares, saves, time spent on post. All of it feeds into a score, and that score determines how widely a piece of content travels. Here is where it gets interesting. The algorithm doesn't evaluate content the way a human editor would, asking whether something is true or valuable or good. It asks, does this generate a response? And certain kinds of content generate stronger responses than others. Content that provokes comparison tends to perform well. Content that triggers aspiration, the curated holiday, the before and after, the life that looks just slightly better than yours, holds attention. It doesn't make you feel good necessarily, but it keeps you scrolling, looking for a resolution that the feed will never quite provide. There's a phrase that researchers use, the social comparison treadmill. The idea that when your reference point for how you're doing is an endless stream of optimized self-presentation, you're always measuring yourself against a standard that was designed to be slightly out of reach. You keep moving, the treadmill keeps running. Instagram didn't invent social comparison, but it built one of the most efficient engines for delivering it at scale that has never existed. YouTube's situation is architecturally different from Instagram's, and the distinction is worth understanding. For most of its life, YouTube's recommendation algorithm had one primary objective: maximize watch time. The thinking was logical. Watch time was a proxy for value. If someone watched a video all the way through and then kept watching, the content must be good. The problem is that watch time isn't a neutral metric. It doesn't distinguish between content that's genuinely engaging and content that's emotionally provocative in ways that make it hard to stop. Outrage holds attention. Anxiety holds attention. Strong emotional states, particularly unresolved ones, hold attention. What the algorithm learned across billions of viewing sessions was that content provoking these states tended to keep people watching longer, so it recommended more of it. Not because anyone decided to push extreme content, because the metric itself, when pursued efficiently enough, led there. Researchers who have studied YouTube's recommendation patterns describe something they called recommendation drift. The way a user can begin on a fairly innocuous video and, through a sequence of individually reasonable recommendations, end up somewhere they never consciously chose to go. Each step seems logical. The cumulative journey doesn't. The autoplay feature accelerates this. The decision to keep watching is never actively made. The next video just begins. Opting out requires action, continuing requires nothing. Default states matter enormously. On by default is not a neutral choice. Any conversation about platform algorithms in 2026 that doesn't include TikTok is an incomplete one, because TikTok didn't just iterate on what Facebook and Instagram built. It rewrote the assumptions entirely. Most social media algorithms are, at their core, social graphs. They show you content from people you follow, people those people follow, and so on. Your network is the foundation. TikTok dispensed with that almost entirely. TikTok's For You page, its primary feed, is driven almost entirely by behavior, not relationships. It doesn't care who you follow. It cares what you watch, what you rewatch, where you pause, and when you scroll past. It's reading microsignals, fractions of seconds, and updating its model for you in real time. The result is an algorithm that can identify your interests, your vulnerabilities, faster than most people can articulate them. Users frequently report a feeling of unease at how precisely the For You page reflects something about them that they hadn't consciously expressed. It's flattering and slightly unsettling in equal measure. This is a different kind of architecture. Instagram learned what you liked. TikTok learns who you are, or at least who you are in the moments you spend on the app, which for a lot of people is quite a few moments. The average TikTok user spends around 90 minutes a day on the platform. That's not an accident. It's a design outcome. There's a layer of this that sits above the feed and the algorithm, and it's worth examining separately: the notification. Notifications are, on the surface, a utility feature. They tell you when something relevant has happened, but the way they've been implemented, the timing, the phrasing, the variable frequency, tells a different story. There is a concept from behavioral psychology called a variable reward schedule. It's the principle behind slot machines. If a reward comes every time you pull the lever, you'll pull it when you want a reward and stop when you don't. But if the reward comes unpredictably, sometimes on the first pull, sometimes after 20, you'll keep pulling far more compulsively. The uncertainty is what drives the behavior. Notifications tuned correctly create exactly this dynamic. Sometimes you open the app and there is something meaningful, a reply from someone you care about, a piece of content that genuinely resonates. Sometimes there's nothing significant at all. The unpredictability is precisely why the checking behavior persists. The platforms know this. The research on variable reward schedules is not obscure. It's undergraduate psychology. The people building these notification systems are not unaware of how attention and compulsion work. They are, and in many cases, experts in it, which is what makes the current legal moment so significant. Because we didn't know is a defense that becomes harder to sustain the more the internal evidence surfaces. Here's the framing that the trial in Los Angeles and the one that follow it are forcing into public view. What is the actual product? The stated product is connection, creativity, information, entertainment. These are the brand promises, the things written in mission statements, repeated in investor presentations, used to recruit engineers who want to feel like they're working on something meaningful. But the operational product, the thing that generates revenue, the thing the algorithms are optimized to produce, is attention. Specifically, sustained, returning, habituated attention. And attention, when you pursue it relentlessly enough, starts to shade into something else. The techniques that maximize engagement aren't neutral. They work precisely because they tap into psychological mechanisms that aren't fully under conscious control. The comparison instinct, the fear of missing out, the dopamine response to unpredictable reward. This doesn't mean the people who build these platforms are villains. Most of them genuinely believed, and many still do, that they were building something valuable. The problem is systematic. When your primary metric is engagement and your revenue model is advertising, the incentive structure will push the product toward maximizing attention, regardless of what that does to the person whose attention is being captured. The big tobacco comparison is being made a lot right now, and it's instructive, but not in the way it's usually framed. The tobacco companies weren't brought down in a single landmark case. They were brought down by the slow accumulation of evidence, internal documents, and public understanding until the political and legal will to act became unavoidable. The knowledge existed inside the companies long before it existed in public view. What the Los Angeles verdict suggests is that we may be at an early version of that same inflection point, not the end of the story, possibly the beginning of a different chapter. The platforms will adapt. They always do. Features will be adjusted, policies will be updated, and companies will point to those changes as evidence of good faith. Some of those changes will be genuine, and some will be cosmetic. But the deeper question, the one that doesn't have an easy answer, is whether an architecture built around the sustained capture of human attention can be meaningfully reformed, or whether the business model itself is the problem. That's the question the courts are now slowly beginning to ask. That's Built to Brand for this week. We don't do trend chasing here, we do first principles. And sometimes first principles lead you somewhere uncomfortable. That's usually where the real story is. If this episode made you think differently about the apps you use, the feeds you scroll, or the invisible decisions behind the products that feel most essential, share it with someone who might find it useful. I'm your host Tanvi, and this is Built to Brand.